The first time Lenora Conley ran, she did not look back, because she knew that if she looked back she would see the face of the man who had spent 4 years convincing her that she belonged to him the way a saddle belongs to a horse, and she was afraid that face alone might be enough to root her feet to the red dirt of Tucson and keep her there forever. It was the spring of 1878, and the Arizona Territory was a place where the land itself seemed to be arguing with the sky, where red rock formations rose up like the knuckles of some buried giant, and the sun pressed down on everything with a weight that was almost personal. Lenora was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair that she kept twisted into a braid because it was practical, and eyes the color of creek water after a heavy rain, somewhere between gray and green depending on the light and her mood. She was not small, not fragile, though Harlan Briggs had spent considerable effort trying to make her feel both of those things. She was 5 feet and 6 inches of hard-won determination, and on the morning she left, she took the $22 she had saved coin by coin from the egg money, a carpet bag with 2 dresses and a photograph of her mother, and the mule Harlan had declared too stubborn to be useful. She agreed with him about the mule. She thought they had a great deal in common. Harlan Briggs was 36, and he was the kind of man who was respected in Tucson because he owned a good portion of the eastern grazing land and could sit very still at the poker table and smile while he took your money. He had courted Lenora when she was 20, right after her father died, and left her with nothing but a leaky roof and a box of debts. Harlan had paid the debts and replaced the roof and told everyone in town that he was a generous man. What he had not told anyone was what he expected in return, or how he delivered his disappointment when those expectations were not met to his satisfaction. He had never struck her. She wanted to be careful about how she explained it to herself, because there were women in the territory who had suffered far worse, women with broken bones and blackened eyes, and she did not want to diminish what they had endured by placing her own suffering alongside it carelessly. But Harlan had other methods. He had a voice that could cut lower than a shout, a kind of cold, precise contempt that he deployed like a scalpel, and he had a way of standing too close and gripping her wrist just hard enough to remind her of the difference in their sizes. He had sold her father's watch without asking. He had opened her letters before she could read them. He had introduced her to his business associates as his property, and when she had gone white with humiliation in front of those men, he had patted her hand and said she ought to be grateful that a man was willing to claim her so plainly. The morning she left, Harlan had ridden to town to see a man about a land deed, and Lenora had watched his horse disappear down the road and felt something shift in her chest like a door swinging open on a hinge she had not known was loose. She had packed in 12 minutes. She had walked out the front door without closing it behind her, which was the only small rebellion she allowed herself, and she had taken the brown mule named Cole and she had ridden north. She had no plan beyond north. North felt like a way, and a way was a direction she had been dreaming about for 4 years. She rode for 3 days through country that was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, all heat and silence, and the occasional red-tailed hawk turning lazy circles overhead, as though it had nowhere particular to be. She camped against rock formations that blocked the wind, and she ate dried beef and cornbread she had wrapped in cloth, and she talked to Cole, who received her conversation with the magnificent indifference of a creature who had decided very early in life that humans were mostly noise. On the 4th day her water ran low, and Cole picked up a stone bruise on his left forefoot, and Lenora sat in the shade of a palo verde tree and looked at the horizon and thought very carefully about her situation. She was north of Tucson, south of the Mogollon Rim, and she knew enough about the territory to know that a woman alone with a lame mule was in a position that called for either a miracle or a town. She chose town on the basis that miracles were less reliably scheduled. There was a town. It was called Harrow Creek, and it sat in a valley between two low ridges in a way that made it look like something the land had accidentally grown rather than anything a person had planned. There was a livery stable, a dry goods store, a saloon called the Copper Nail, a small church that was also sometimes a schoolhouse, a blacksmith, and a scattering of houses and outbuildings that suggested a population somewhere in the low hundreds. There was also a ranch visible from the edge of town, set back about a quarter-mile on a rise, with good fences and a barn that looked new enough to still be yellow from the cut lumber. Lenora rode Cole slowly down the main street of Harrow Creek at mid-afternoon on a Thursday in April of 1878, and she was aware that several people were watching her from doorways and windows, with the frank curiosity of people in small towns who did not see many strangers and considered staring to be a perfectly reasonable response to novelty. She stopped at the livery stable first because Cole needed attention before she did, and this was simply her nature. The livery man, a wide-shouldered fellow named Dodd with a gray beard and very kind eyes, looked Cole over and said the bruise was not serious and that the mule would be fine in a few days with proper rest, and he could take him on for 3 cents a day. He did not ask her where she had come from or where she was going, and she liked him very much for that. She paid him a week in advance and asked if there was a place in town that took boarders. Dodd tilted his head. Widow Marsh sometimes takes boarders. She is on the far end of the street, the house with the blue curtains. Whether she has a room free at present I could not say. Lenora thanked him and walked down the street carrying her carpet bag, and doing her best to look like a woman who had a very ordinary and respectable reason for arriving alone on a lame mule with dust on every surface of her person. Widow Marsh did have a room, a small one at the back of the house with a window that looked out at a garden that had been planted with more ambition than water. The widow was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had seen enough of the world to know there was something more complicated than a simple journey behind Lenora's careful, composed expression, and she asked the room rate, which was 40 cents a week including breakfast, and she did not pry. Lenora slept for 12 hours that first night and woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee and biscuits and felt, for the first time in longer than she could measure, that she was breathing correctly. She was 3 weeks into her residence at Widow Marsh's house, and she had found herself some work helping at the dry goods store in exchange for a small wage, and she had begun to learn the texture of Harrow Creek the way you learn any place by accumulating small details, when she first laid eyes on Cecil Morgan. He came into town on a Friday, which was when he usually came into town, she would later learn, riding a big buckskin horse with the easy posture of a man who had spent so much of his life in a saddle that the saddle was simply where he kept his body when he was not actively doing something else. He was 28 years old, which she did not know yet, and he had the kind of face that the sun and wind had been working on for long enough to make it interesting, all angles and weathered brown skin, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved with some intention. His hat was brown and well worn, and he wore it at no particular angle, just straight, which for reasons she could not articulate she found she liked. He was not the tallest man she had ever seen, but he was built with a kind of lean, purposeful solidity, like a good fence post, which was not the most romantic comparison she had ever constructed in her mind, but it had the virtue of accuracy. He tipped his hat to her as he went into the dry goods store where she was sweeping the front step, a single unhurried dip of the brim, and said good afternoon and asked if Mr. Yates was in, and she said yes, and he went inside and she stood there with her broom and noticed that something in her chest had done a small, startled thing that she chose to categorize as surprise, and then promptly chose not to think about. His name was Cecil Morgan, and she learned this because in a town like Harrow Creek, you learned names the way you collected anything in small amounts, by simple proximity and repetition. Cecil Morgan had a cattle ranch north of town, the one she had noticed from the road on her way in, 140 acres with good grass and a creek that ran year-round, and a herd of around 200 head. He had built the ranch himself over the course of 6 years, starting with 30 acres and a small cabin and building outward through the kind of work that is not glamorous, but is instead just very steady and very constant, the daily accumulation of effort that eventually becomes something real. He was not a man who talked a great deal, but when he talked, he said what he meant, and what he meant was usually either practical or kind, and very often both at the same time. He had a foreman named Billy Tate who was younger than him by 6 years and chatty enough to compensate for Cecil's quietness, and 2 ranch hands named Marsh and Curo, who she did not know well yet. Lenora learned these things the way you learn about people in small towns, in pieces, over cups of coffee at the store and conversations on the street, and the fragments of information that drift in the air of a small community like seeds looking for somewhere to land. She was not seeking information about Cecil Morgan specifically. She was simply gathering information about all of the people around her because that was how she had always understood the world, by learning the shapes of the people who occupied it. She did not want to be interested in a man. She had some fairly strong feelings on that subject that she rehearsed to herself regularly, particularly in the mornings when she was lying in her small room at Widow Marsh's listening to the birds and reminding herself of what she had come from and why she had left. She was not going to become anyone's property again. She was not going to allow a man to define the perimeter of her world. She was building something here, something small and careful and entirely her own, and she was not interested in complicating it. And then one evening in late April, about 4 weeks into her stay in Harrow Creek, she was coming back from the store later than usual because Mr. Yates had needed help with the inventory count, and she turned the corner near the livery and nearly walked directly into Cecil Morgan, who was coming from the opposite direction with a bag of grain on his shoulder and who stopped in time to avoid the collision and then steadied her with one hand on her elbow, briefly and immediately withdrawn. "Pardon me," he said. "I should have been watching where I was going." "No," she said. "I came around that corner too fast." He looked at her for a moment in the last of the day's light, which was that particular gold that April evenings in Arizona will sometimes produce, and said, "You are the woman who has been working at Yates' store." "I am," she said, "Lenora Conley." "Cecil Morgan," he said, and the way he said his own name was not self-important or elaborate, just plain and sure, like he had no doubts about it. "I have the ranch north of town." "I know," she said. "Small town." The corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "Small town," he agreed. "Are you settling in Harrow Creek, Miss Conley?" "I am doing my best to," she said, which was honest and also more guarded than a simple yes, and she watched him hear the difference between those two things and choose not to press it. "It is a good town," he said simply. "Not a perfect one, but a good one." He adjusted the grain bag on his shoulder. "Enjoy your evening, Miss Conley." "You as well, Mr. Morgan." He walked on, and she walked on, and she stood in front of Widow Marsh's house for a moment before going inside, and told herself very firmly that a pleasant exchange with a courteous man was not a thing requiring further examination. She examined it anyway briefly, that night before she slept. Then she went to sleep and dreamed of nothing in particular and woke the next morning, and swept the front step and thought about inventory. The following weeks passed with the slow, pleasant rhythm of ordinary life, which was something Lenora had not had enough of, and was discovering she was very grateful for. She worked at the store. She took her meals at Widow Marsh's table or occasionally at the small restaurant that the woman who ran the laundry also operated from her kitchen on Thursday evenings, and she walked Cole twice a week once his foot had healed because the mule seemed to benefit from the exercise, and so did she. She attended church on Sundays in the same way she attended most things in Harrow Creek, quietly and with attention, because the church was also the place where the social life of the town was organized, and she was building her understanding of this community brick by brick. Cecil Morgan attended church too. He sat 3 rows from the back on the left side, and he sang the hymns in a baritone that was not trained but was sincere, and he gave up his place in line after the service to older women without being asked. She noticed these things. She was not cataloging them. She was simply observant by nature. He stopped by the store on a Tuesday in early May when she was alone there, Mr. Yates having stepped out to deal with a delivery issue at the back of the building, and he needed a spool of wire and some liniment, and a pair of work gloves in a size that Mr. Yates kept on the top shelf. She got the gloves down from the top shelf and he thanked her, and then he looked at the bookshelves along the side wall, which were one of Mr. Yates' secondary enterprises, lending books for 2 cents a week, and he said he had been meaning to return the one he had borrowed. "Which one?" she asked. He set a novel on the counter, with a care that suggested he had been thoughtful about keeping it in good condition. It was a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, and she looked at it and then looked at him. "Do you like George Eliot?" she asked, because she could not entirely help it. "I do," he said without any defensiveness. "I find her very clear-eyed about people. She does not make them simpler than they are." Lenora thought about this for a moment. "No," she said, "she does not. Do you read much, Miss Conley?" "As much as I am able," she said. "I went through most of the Yates lending shelf in my first 2 weeks here." Mr. Yates was very pleased and also slightly alarmed. That corner of his mouth movement again, broader this time, almost definitely a smile. "You might enjoy his copy of Roughing It if you have not gotten to it, though perhaps you have seen enough of the territory in person that you do not need Mark Twain's version of it." She laughed, which surprised her, a genuine short laugh that she felt in her chest. "Perhaps," she said, "though I find the territory looks different on paper than it does on the back of a mule." "I expect it does," he said. "Almost everything does." He paid for his items and thanked her and left, and she stood at the counter for a moment listening to the sound of his horse moving away, and acknowledged to herself with some resignation that she was going to have a great deal of difficulty remaining uninvested in Cecil Morgan as a subject of human interest. May turned into June, and the heat deepened, and the town of Harrow Creek settled into the slow, baked rhythm of an Arizona summer. There was a community supper on the first Saturday of June, held outside in the cooling evening air behind the church, because this was one of the regular social events that held small towns together in the same way mortar holds stones together. And Lenora went because Widow Marsh went, and because she had reached the point in her residence in Harrow Creek where not attending would have constituted a statement. She helped set out the food because she was not a woman who stood around when there was setting out to be done, and the result of this was that she was behind the long tables when Cecil Morgan arrived with Billy Tate and contributed what appeared to be a very large pot of beef stew, which he set down at the end of the table with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he seemed to bring to most things. "You cook," she said, which came out slightly more directly than she had intended. He looked at her without embarrassment. "A man who cannot cook on his own ranch is a man who is either very lucky or very hungry. I prefer not to rely on luck." "That is a very sensible philosophy," she said. "I am a sensible man, Miss Conley," he said with that almost smile. "Generally speaking." They found themselves sitting near each other at the supper, because these things happen in small towns with the inevitability of geography. And they talked through most of the meal about practical things and then about less practical things. And at some point, Lenora realized that the sun had fully set and the lanterns were lit, and the conversation had covered ranching and books, and the merits of various methods of preserving vegetables, and the political situation in the territory, and the somewhat eccentric character of the minister's sermons. And she was not certain how all of that had happened or exactly how long they had been talking. Only that it had been a very long time, and she had not noticed the passage of it at all. Billy Tate caught her eye from down the table and winked at her with the cheerful transparency of a young man who considered himself very clever, and she gave him a look that she hoped communicated her lack of appreciation for this, and he grinned wider, and she thought that Billy Tate was going to be a problem. Walking home with Widow Marsh later that evening, the older woman said nothing for a full block and then said, "Cecil Morgan is a good man. I have known him since he came to this valley 6 years ago with 30 acres and a dream and both arms in working order, and his chin pointed forward. He is the kind of man who keeps his word and does not make noise about it. I was simply sitting next to him," Lenora said. "Of course you were," said Widow Marsh pleasantly. It was in the second week of June that the letter arrived. She was sorting the morning mail at the store because Mr. Yates had given her this task, and she saw the envelope with the Tucson postmark and felt the blood drain out of her face with a speed and completeness that was physical, like a lamp going out. She knew the handwriting. She had seen it on invoices and on the notes he had left pinned to the kitchen door when he was displeased. She set the letter on the counter very carefully, the way you set down something that might break or bite, and she stood with both hands flat on the wood and breathed. She did not open it. She thought about burning it. She thought about what it meant that he had found where she was, or had at least found a town to send a letter to, and whether that meant he had only tracked her this far or whether it meant he was coming, and the thinking produced a cold, sick feeling in her stomach that she recognized from years of practice. She took the letter to her room at noon and sat on the edge of her bed and read it with the curtain drawn. It was short. Harlan Briggs was not a man who wasted words any more than he wasted money. He wrote that she had embarrassed him considerably. He wrote that she had taken his mule, which was his property, along with a sum of money that he considered his as well, and that her behavior was something he was prepared to overlook in light of what he called her confusion, which was his word for every feeling she had ever had that he disagreed with. He wrote that he expected her to return within a reasonable time, and that he had ways of finding out where people had gotten to, and that this would go a great deal better for her if she came back on her own than if he had to come and collect her. He wrote that she was his, and he expected her to remember it. She folded the letter and sat with it in her hands for a long time. The sun came through the gap in the curtain and made a bright line across the floor, and she watched it move. She was not going back. This she knew with a clarity that was almost calm. She would not go back under any circumstances, not because of stubbornness, but because she understood with a certainty she could not have articulated 4 years ago, but could articulate now, very precisely, that going back was not returning to safety, but returning to a kind of living that was not really living, that was only existing within the space someone else had decided to allow her. But the letter meant he was looking, and looking meant he might find her, and found meant something she did not want to think about in too much detail. She went back to the store and finished the day's work, and that evening she told Widow Marsh, because Widow Marsh had become in a matter of weeks the closest thing to a confidant she had, and Widow Marsh listened to the whole of it without interrupting and then set down her sewing and said, "You will need to decide whether you are going to stay here or run again." "I do not want to run again," Lenora said. "Then you are going to need to be prepared for what staying looks like," Widow Marsh said simply. Lenora thought about this for several days. She went about her work, and she walked coal, and she attended church, and she did not say anything to anyone else. And then on a Saturday afternoon, she was sitting on the bench outside the dry goods store in the shade, because Mr. Yates had closed early for a family occasion, and Cecil Morgan rode in from the direction of his ranch and tied his horse and came to conduct whatever business he had. And when he came back out and found her still sitting there staring at the middle distance, he stopped and looked at her with the direct attention that was one of the things she had come to associate with him. "Miss Conley," he said, "you look like a woman with something on her mind that is too heavy to put down." She looked up at him and made a decision, not a romantic decision, a practical one made by a person who needed to say the thing out loud to someone she had decided she could trust, and who had decided she could trust Cecil Morgan on the basis of 6 weeks of careful observation. "I am in a situation," she said. "I have left a man in Tucson who considered me his property and who has written to tell me I should come back. I am not going back. I am wondering whether he is the sort of man who will come looking." Cecil was quiet for a moment in the way he was always quiet, not a hesitation but a thinking. Then he sat down on the other end of the bench, setting enough distance between them to be proper, and said, "Tell me about this man." She told him, not all of it at once, not the worst of it, but enough. She told him about Harlan Briggs and the land and the debts and the way 4 years had accumulated and what the letter had said. She told it plainly, without excess feeling, because that was how she was able to tell it, and she watched him listen. When she was done, Cecil looked at the street in front of them, which was quiet in the afternoon heat, and said, "Harlan Briggs. I have heard that name. He came up in conversation at the cattlemen's meeting in Flagstaff last fall. The impression I was left with was not a favorable one." "No," she said. "He makes favorable impressions on people he wants something from. The other impressions he makes are different." "Miss Conley," Cecil said, and he turned to look at her with an expression that was very steady and very direct. "You are a free woman, and you are not anyone's property. Not this man's and not anyone else's. The law in this territory is imperfect, and I will not pretend otherwise, but this is 1878, and a woman who has walked away from an arrangement that was not a lawful marriage has walked away from it, and there is no paper that makes you go back." She looked at him. "He has papers," she said. "He has papers on everything. He has papers on the mule." Cecil looked at Cole, who was tied to the post outside the livery down the street, and then he said, "What is the mule's name?" "Cole," she said. "Did you name him?" "Yes," she said. "Harlan said the name was stupid." "Harlan Briggs," Cecil said thoughtfully, "sounds like a man with a great many opinions about things that are not his business." He looked back at her. "If he comes to Harrow Creek, he will find that this town has opinions of its own, and he will find that I have some particular opinions about men who follow women and use words like property to describe them." She did not say anything for a moment. She was not accustomed to people saying things like this on her behalf, and she was finding it difficult to receive gracefully because she did not have much practice. "I do not need rescuing," she said, which was important to establish. "No," Cecil agreed without any argument or qualification. "You do not, but you might benefit from a neighbor." She looked at him and he looked back, and the afternoon sun made long shadows down the street, and she thought about the word neighbor and what it could contain, and she said, "Yes, I think I might." They sat there for another 10 minutes talking about entirely ordinary things, about the summer grazing and the question of whether the creek in the valley would hold through July. And when he stood to leave, he said he would be in town on Thursday, and that if she found herself free for supper, the restaurant that was operated out of Mrs. Fenwick's kitchen on Thursday evenings served a tolerable roast chicken, and would she like to have supper with him? She said she would. It was a first step, and it was taken carefully, and it was taken by two people who both understood something about the value of things built slowly on solid ground. The supper at Mrs. Fenwick's on Thursday was pleasant and easy in a way that surprised Lenora, because she had half expected the formality of it to produce a kind of stiffness between them. But Cecil Morgan was not a stiff man, and she was not a formal woman, and the conversation moved the way good conversations do, without a great deal of effort, taking turns in the way water finds its way around rocks, naturally. They talked about the ranch and about her life before Tucson, which she kept light and general, and he told her about coming to the territory from Kansas at 22 with a small inheritance from his grandfather and an idea that land in Arizona was still cheap enough for a man with ambition and patience to build something real on. "Were you right?" she asked. "About the land being cheap?" "Yes," he said. "About patience being enough on its own?" "No." There were a few years that required considerably more than patience. What else did they require? He considered. "Stubbornness," he said, "which is different from patience. Patience is waiting for the right moment. Stubbornness is refusing to quit during the wrong one." She liked this distinction. She wrote it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that seemed important. He walked her back to Widow Marsh's house after supper, and at the gate he said good night and tipped his hat, and that was the whole of the physical contact between them, which was appropriate, and she went inside feeling warm in a way that had nothing to do with the June heat. She saw him the following Thursday and the Thursday after that, and in between she saw him in town in the natural course of their lives, stopping to talk on the street or in the store, and she began to understand the particular texture of a companionship that was growing into something more, without either of them saying anything about it directly. There was a quality to Cecil's attention that she found herself responding to in spite of herself, a kind of seeing that was not invasive or possessive, but simply present, the way you notice something precious without needing to claim it. He had her out to the ranch one Sunday afternoon in late June, because Billy Tate had said something about the horses that she had expressed interest in, and Cecil had said she was welcome to come and see them. And she had ridden Cole out in the Sunday afternoon heat and seen the ranch properly for the first time. It was a good property, better than it had looked from the road, with a long porch on the main house and a kitchen garden alongside it that was productive enough to suggest someone had been giving it serious attention, which Cecil confirmed was him, and she stood in the kitchen garden with the sun making long light through the bean plants and felt something in her ease considerably. He showed her the horses and introduced her to Billy Tate, who was 22 and brown-haired, and had the kind of enthusiastic social energy that made you feel he would have liked to immediately arrange a wedding if someone had asked him to. And he clearly decided that Lenora was excellent, and excellent was the word he used, said directly to her face, which she found both flattering and slightly overwhelming. She also met Curo, one of the ranch hands, who was from Sonora originally and spoke both Spanish and English with equal facility, and who looked at Cecil and then at Lenora with a quiet, appreciative nod that she understood to mean something like "it is about time," which again, in the way of Billy Tate's enthusiasm, both touched her and made her want to explain that it was not a thing that could be hurried. She stayed for supper. This was not entirely planned, but the afternoon had stretched pleasantly into evening, and Cecil had said he was going to cook, and there was plenty, and would she stay? And she had looked at the kitchen with its good iron stove and the smell of something already working on it, and she had said yes. He made biscuits from scratch in a cast-iron skillet, while the venison stew finished on the back of the stove, and she sat at the kitchen table and watched him work with a competence that was unself-conscious. And she thought about how different it was to be in a kitchen with a man who moved in it like it was his own, not like a visitor suffering through it. Billy Tate ate with them and did most of the talking, and Cecil let him, contributing only when he had something specific to add, and the evening was good in the way that very uncomplicated things are sometimes very good, through the simple fact of them. She rode Cole home in the dark, and there was a near full moon, and the desert was silver and silent, and she let herself feel, for a moment without censoring it, that she might be building something here that mattered. The second letter from Harlan Briggs arrived in July. It was brief and colder than the first. It said he was in possession of information about her whereabouts. It said he intended to visit and retrieve what was his. It used those words exactly, retrieve and his, and she sat with it at the kitchen table at Widow Marsh's house and felt the cold move through her that she had been keeping at bay all through June. She did not keep this one to herself. She folded it and put it in her pocket, and that afternoon when Cecil came into town she showed it to him without much preamble, because they had arrived at the point in their friendship, or whatever it was becoming, where she could do that. He read it. His expression did not change very much, but something in his jaw did, a tightening that she understood was not directed at her. "He is coming," he said. "He says he is," she said. Cecil looked at the letter for a moment longer and then folded it and handed it back to her. "Lenora," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed the shift of it, the different weight. "What do you want to happen?" "I want him to understand that I am not going back," she said. "I want him to understand it in a way that means it is settled and he does not come back again afterward." "Then we will make that plain," Cecil said. And the way he said "we" was not possessive. It was not the way Harlan said things that put two people together because he wanted to own both of them. It was the way you say we when you mean that a person is not alone. She understood the difference. Over the following week, Cecil told Widow Marsh, because Widow Marsh already knew enough of the story to deserve the full picture, and she told Mr. Yates, because she felt her employer had a right to know what was coming, and both of them received the information with a quiet solidness that she had come to understand was characteristic of Harrow Creek. This small town that was, she had discovered, a place where people looked out for one another with a practicality that was more useful than sentiment. The marshal of Harrow Creek was a man named Abel Cord who had held the post for 9 years and had seen the territory change around him, and had the kind of institutional memory that made him genuinely useful. Cecil spoke to Abel Cord one morning before Lenora arrived in town, which she only found out later, and this was the only thing about the whole business that she had a small argument with Cecil about, the private nature of that conversation, because she had some feelings about men making decisions on her behalf without consulting her that were, she felt, entirely reasonable. Cecil received this argument with respect and acknowledged that he should have spoken to her first, and said he was sorry, which was more than she had expected and more than she had ever received from Harlan Briggs for anything that had ever happened, and the argument was resolved in the way good arguments between reasonable people are resolved, through genuine acknowledgement and the willingness to do better. Abel Cord, when she spoke to him herself, was straightforward about the legal landscape. She had left a common law situation that would be difficult for any court to enforce as binding, and she had taken a mule that Harlan would claim was his and a sum of money that he might also claim. And the law in 1878 in the Arizona Territory was not reliably on the side of women in these situations, which he said plainly and without apology because he was not a man who told women comfortable lies. But he also said that Harlan Briggs had no paper that compelled her return, and that whatever Harlan's intentions were when he arrived, the marshal's office would be watching. "I appreciate your honesty," Lenora told him. "It is the only kind I know how to offer," Abel Cord said, and went back to his desk. Harlan Briggs arrived in Harrow Creek on a Wednesday afternoon in late July, which was not the day anyone had expected, because the letter had suggested a later time. Lenora was at the store when she heard the particular sound of a horse she recognized, which was a thing she would not have predicted she could do, but apparently 4 years of proximity could make you recognize a horse's gait the same way you recognized a voice. She felt the recognition in her stomach before she consciously processed what it was. She came to the front of the store and looked out the window and saw Harlan Briggs riding down the main street of Harrow Creek on his big gray horse, and he had the posture he always had when he rode into a new place, that deliberate, proprietary ease, as if he were assessing the value of everything he looked at. He was wearing a good coat despite the July heat, and he looked like what he was, a man with money who expected that to matter. Mr. Yates was standing beside her and he said nothing, just moved slightly so he was standing in the doorway. Harlan saw her through the window. She watched him see her, watched the recognition and the satisfaction settle across his face, and she thought, "I am not afraid of you," and she almost believed it. She went to the front door and opened it and stepped out onto the front step. She would not be in a box when she dealt with him. She would be on the open street in the daylight in front of the whole of Harrow Creek. He had the good grace not to dismount immediately, as if he wanted to keep the height advantage as long as possible. He stopped his horse 10 feet from the step and looked at her. "Lenora," he said, "there you are." "Here I am," she said. "You have had your time to run," he said, and his voice was the voice she remembered, that cold precision. "It is time to come home now." "This is my home," she said. "I work here, I live here, I am not coming back to Tucson." His jaw tightened. "You took my mule," he said. "I took Cole," she said. "I named him, I fed him for 3 years. I would argue the point on ownership. You took my money." "I took $22 that I earned from the egg money over the course of 4 years," she said. We can discuss what 4 years of labor is worth if you like. He looked at her with that expression she knew well, that flat, controlled displeasure that had always preceded the cold voice, the gripping wrist, the 14 different ways of reminding her what he thought her value was and who said it. He had expected she understood that she would be smaller in this moment, that the months of distance would have reduced her the way absence sometimes reduces confidence, and she would be grateful to see him and easier to manage. She was not smaller. She was, if anything, larger. She heard boots on the steps of the building across the street, unhurried. She did not have to look to know who it was because she knew the sound of those boots by now as well. Cecil Morgan came down the steps of the marshal's office, where he had been speaking with Abel Cord when the gray horse had come into town, and he crossed the street at a walk that was the exact opposite of hurried, because hurrying would have suggested urgency and urgency would have suggested threat. And what Cecil was projecting was simply the calm presence of a man who had somewhere to be and had decided it was here. He came to stand beside her on the step, not in front of her, not behind her, beside her, and he looked up at Harlan Briggs on his gray horse with an expression that was completely unimpressed. Harlan looked at him. "Who are you?" "Cecil Morgan," Cecil said. "I have a ranch north of town. This is between me and the woman," Harlan said. "Miss Conley," Cecil said, his voice unchanged, "can decide who is part of any conversation that involves her." Harlan's gaze moved between them and she watched him recalibrating, trying to understand the situation, trying to determine whether this was going to be handled easily or not. He was a smart man, which was one of the things that made him dangerous, and he was reading the street now the way he read a room, looking for leverage. "Lenora," he said, and he used the particular tone, the patient, reasonable one that sounded to strangers like affection and felt to her like a collar. "You are confused. You have been out here alone and you have made some decisions that were not clear-headed, and I am willing to overlook all of that if you come home with me now." "She is not confused," Cecil said without heat, "and she is not going anywhere with you." "I did not ask you," Harlan said, and his voice dropped into something harder. "No," Cecil agreed. "You did not ask her either." Abel Cord had come out of the marshal's office and was standing on the opposite side of the street, which was a visible presence that said something without saying it. Mr. Yates was still in the doorway behind her. Widow Marsh, who had apparently seen the gray horse from her window at the end of the street, had arrived at the edge of the scene with the quiet determination of a woman who had no particular patience for bullies. Harlan looked at all of this, and she watched him understand that he had miscalculated something. He had expected a lone woman in a small town who would be embarrassed and grateful and manageable. He had found instead a woman standing on a step with a community around her and a man beside her who had the look of someone who would stand there all day and not get tired of it. "The mule," he said, shifting tactics. "The mule is my property." "My mule's name is Cole," Lenora said. "And the $22 I took was my labor, and I will not argue about it further because it is not an argument I am willing to have." Harlan looked at her for a long, tight moment, and she met his eyes and did not look away, which was something she had not been able to do in Tucson, not reliably, not without paying for it later. She looked at him now, and she felt the difference of doing it with solid ground under her feet and people around her, and the particular knowledge that this was her street, her town, her life that she had built out of nothing and determination and $22. "You are making a mistake," he said. "I made my biggest mistake 4 years ago," she said. "This is me correcting it." His eyes moved to Cecil once more. Cecil looked back at him with that same complete, unhurried lack of impression. There was no aggression in Cecil's posture, no challenge, just the absolute, immovable presence of a man who had decided exactly where he stood and had no interest in moving. "Property does not eat supper at my table," Cecil said, and his voice was quiet and entirely conversational. "Miss Conley has supper at my table. You understand the difference." Harlan Briggs stared at him. "I believe I do," Harlan said at last, and his voice had shifted into something else, something that was not quite retreat but was adjacent to the moment before it. Abel Cord crossed the street and stood near Harlan's horse and said, very quietly and professionally, that he understood Mr. Briggs had ridden a long way, and that there was water at the livery for his horse, and a room at the boarding house if he needed to rest before his return journey, and that the return journey was the anticipated next event in Mr. Briggs's time in Harrow Creek. There was a silence of perhaps 15 seconds. Then Harlan turned his horse and rode to the livery, because he was a smart man and smart men know when they have lost the field, and the street of Harrow Creek exhaled something collectively. Lenora was not going to weep on the front step of the dry goods store. She was not. She pressed her lips together and breathed twice through her nose, and then she looked at Cecil and said, "Thank you for standing beside me." "It is the only place I know to stand," Cecil said simply. Harlan rested his horse that afternoon and was gone by the following morning. Abel Cord confirmed it. He did not come back. Lenora would receive one final letter 2 months later, terse and conclusive, in which Harlan Briggs said that she could keep the mule and the money, and that he considered the matter concluded, which she understood to mean that his pride had found a way to frame the situation as a decision he had made rather than one that had been made for him. And she did not argue with this interpretation, because she no longer needed to argue with anything Harlan Briggs thought. She burned the letter in the kitchen stove at Widow Marsh's house and went back to her work and felt, with a depth and certainty she had not expected, that something was over and something else was beginning. The beginning of the something else was careful and slow and exactly right. She and Cecil had supper together on Thursday evenings at Mrs. Fenwick's, and sometimes on Sunday afternoons she rode Cole out to the ranch, and sometimes he came to town, and they walked in the evening when the heat had eased, and they talked about everything, not just the practical things but the real things, the things you tell people when you have decided they are trustworthy enough for the interior of your life. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was 16, and about her father, who had been a gentle man undone by grief and then by debt, and about the 12 years of scrambling that had preceded Harlan Briggs, which had made his offer of stability feel like something she could not afford to refuse. She told him about the accumulation of the 4 years and all the small ways in which she had been diminished, and all the small ways she had found to push back against it, and the morning she had walked out the front door without closing it behind her, which felt, telling it now, both enormous and oddly simple. He listened in the way he listened, with his full, uninterrupted attention, and when she was done he did not immediately fill the silence with comfort or solutions or anything. He just let the silence be there for a moment, which was, she had come to understand, his way of treating what she said as something that deserved the weight of actual consideration. And then he said, "You are the most capable person I have met in this territory, and I have met quite a few of them." She shook her head. "I mean it," he said, "not despite what you have been through. I mean your capacity to walk out of something that was crushing you and to build this here and to stand on that street in front of that man and not waver. That is a kind of strength that is not common." She looked at him in the evening light, which was doing that particular August thing where it turned everything amber, and she thought about what it meant to be seen by a person who had actually looked. "Tell me about you," she said. "Not the ranch, the rest of it." He was quiet for a moment, which she recognized was not reluctance but organization, the way he always organized himself before he said something that mattered. And then he told her about Kansas and about his mother, who had been Choctaw and who had faced a kind of quiet, persistent injustice that he had grown up watching and had grown up angry about, though he had learned to carry the anger differently as he got older, more precisely. He told her about his father, who had been a white farmer and a decent man, and about the way the world had looked at his parents together and found reasons to make it difficult. He told her about inheriting the stubbornness he had mentioned, about coming west partly because he wanted land and partly because he wanted distance from the particular brand of judgment that had colored his childhood, and about the 6 years of building the ranch, and the ways the territory had been both better and worse than he expected. He told her that he had not brought another person into his life in the 6 years since he came here, not because he was indifferent to the idea, but because he had watched enough of the wrong kinds of relationships to be careful about the right one. "What does the right one look like to you?" she asked. He turned and looked at her with that direct, certain attention. "Like two people who respect each other enough to be honest," he said, "and who like each other enough that honesty is not a burden." She thought about this. "That is a better answer than most people would give." "I have had 6 years to think about it," he said, "mostly while mending fences, which gives you a great deal of uninterrupted thinking time." She laughed and he smiled, actually smiled, the full version, which she had been accumulating in small quantities and found she valued very highly. She was in love with him by September. She knew this with the same clear-eyed certainty with which she knew other true things. The way she knew the creek would run lower in August, and the way she knew the mule was stubborn, and the way she knew that the self she was in Harrow Creek was more fully herself than she had been in any other place or time. She was in love with Cecil Morgan's steadiness, and his dry humor and his particular form of goodness, which was not showy or self-congratulatory, but simply present in the way he moved through the world and treated people and kept his word. She did not say so immediately because she was a woman who had learned to move carefully, and because she wanted to be sure the feeling was what she thought it was and not just gratitude or relief dressed up in stronger clothing. She gave it several weeks of observation and concluded that it was its own thing entirely, independent of any other feeling, and that it was not going anywhere. He told her first. It was October, and the nights were getting cool and the days were still bright, and they were sitting on the porch of the ranch house after a Sunday supper, and the valley was spread out below them in the long evening light, and he said, with the same directness he brought to everything, that he was in love with her, and that he had been for some time, and that he thought she should know. She looked at him for a moment, and he looked back at her with that absolute steadiness that was one of the things she loved about him. No performance, no anxiety, just the plain offering of a true thing, which she could take or set aside as she chose, and he would accept either with dignity. "I am in love with you as well," she said. "I have been for approximately 6 weeks, and I have been being very thorough about confirming it." Something in his face moved, something warm and real, and he reached out and took her hand in both of his, carefully, the way you take something you intend to be responsible for. And she let him. And they sat there in the October evening with the horses moving in the paddock and the first stars coming up over the eastern ridge. And she thought that this was what it was supposed to feel like, being with a person you had chosen, being held by someone who had not taken the holding for granted. He asked her to marry him in November, on a Saturday morning when she had ridden Cole out to the ranch for no particular reason except that she had wanted to. And he had been working in the kitchen garden, which he continued to tend with a seriousness she found deeply charming. And he came to the fence when he saw her ride up, and he said, very simply, that he would very much like to marry her if she was willing, and that he wanted her to know it would be a partnership and not a possession. And that he had been thinking about how to say that last part in a way that acknowledged everything she had been through without being heavy about it, and he was not sure he had succeeded. "You have," she said from the back of the mule. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "That is absolutely a yes," she said. He grinned, the full grin that she had catalogued carefully over the preceding months, and she swung down from Cole, and he came through the gate, and they stood in the November morning with the frost still on the grass, and he kissed her for the first time, carefully and then with a warmth that was neither hurried nor restrained but exactly right. And Cole observed all of this from a distance of 6 feet, with the magnificent indifference of a creature who had been waiting for the rest of them to catch up. They were married in December of 1878, in the church that was also the schoolhouse, by the minister whose sermons she had always found somewhat eccentric, but who was entirely adequate to the occasion of a wedding. Widow Marsh stood with her, and Billy Tate stood with Cecil and Abel Cord and Mr. Yates, and the whole of the small community of Harrow Creek sat in the pews, and the afternoon sun came through the windows at an angle that turned everything gold. And she stood beside Cecil Morgan in a dress that was the deep blue of creek water in full shadow, and said her vows with a steadiness that surprised her and a joy that did not. Cecil said his vows looking at her face and not at the minister, which was one of the best things anyone had ever done for her. The reception afterward was at the community hall, which was the saloon with its furniture rearranged, and the bar temporarily reassigned to the serving of cider and tea. And it was loud and cheerful, and Billy Tate made a speech that went on considerably longer than necessary, but was genuinely warm underneath all the talking. And Widow Marsh danced with the blacksmith and looked 20 years younger doing it. And Lenora stood in the middle of all of it with her husband beside her, and felt something so uncomplicated and large that she could not find words for it, and decided she did not need to. They rode home to the ranch together that night, the two of them and Cole, who insisted on coming and who Billy Tate had decorated with a small ribbon that Cole spent the whole ride attempting to reach with his nose and remove. She came to know the ranch through the seasons, through the winter that was cold but not brutal, and the spring that was soft and full of promise, and the summer that was hard in the way that ranching summers are hard, but also abundant in the way that a well-tended piece of land rewards the tending. She took over the kitchen garden with a thoroughness that surprised Cecil and delighted herself, expanding it considerably, and adding a section of herbs that she had read about in a book and wanted to try. She helped with the cattle work in the ways she was useful, and learned the ways she was not yet useful, and was patient about the learning, which was a quality she had, the patience for acquiring new skills, that she had not had adequate space to exercise in Tucson. Billy Tate got himself a sweetheart in the spring, a girl named Rosa who helped at the laundry and who thought Billy was wonderful, which Lenora felt was either evidence of strong character or a very specialized kind of vision, but who she liked enormously. Cecil performed the introductions with the visible satisfaction of a man watching something he had hoped for come together. Curo taught her enough Spanish to manage a conversation and enough about horses to feel confident, and in exchange, she taught him to read better English, because he had the basics but wanted more precision, and they spent 2 evenings a week at the kitchen table with books and considerable mutual goodwill. She wrote to her mother's sister in Missouri, a letter she had been composing in her head for years, telling her where she was and what had happened and what had become of it all. The reply came 6 weeks later and was warm in a way that made her cry at the kitchen table, just briefly, and then wipe her eyes and read it again more slowly. In the summer of 1879, she discovered she was expecting a child. This discovery came with a complex of feelings that she sat with carefully for several days before she told Cecil, because she wanted to have some understanding of her own interior before she introduced another person's feelings to it. Her feelings, upon examination, were primarily joy, with some reasonable apprehension mixed in, and a kind of wonder at the shape her life had taken. And when she told Cecil on an evening in July when they were sitting on the porch she had come to love, watching the last of the summer light on the valley, he was very still for a moment, and then he turned to her, and his face had an expression she had not seen on it before, something that was deeper than any expression she had logged. Something that looked very much like a man seeing the full extent of something he had been hoping for and finding it exceeded what he had imagined. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I am well," she said. "I feel a great many things at once." "Tell me," he said. So she told him the joy and the apprehension and the wonder, and he listened, and then he said that he felt those things too, and that the apprehension was reasonable, and the joy was real, and the wonder was the most appropriate response he could imagine to a piece of news like this. He held her hand through the rest of that evening, and they talked about the future in a way that felt different from any future talking she had done before, because the future they were talking about was one they were genuinely building together, not one that was being arranged around her. The pregnancy went well, which she was grateful for and did not take for granted, having heard enough stories about how it could go to maintain a serious appreciation for how it was going. Widow Marsh came out to the ranch regularly and became a kind of informal midwife-adjacent presence, offering advice that was practical and experience-based. And Cecil was the kind of expectant father who paid attention to everything and asked useful questions and did not fuss or panic, which she found deeply reassuring. Their son was born in March of 1880, on a clear, cold morning with the sunrise doing something extraordinary over the eastern ridge, and he arrived with a decisive amount of noise that suggested he had very strong opinions about his situation from the very beginning. They named him Emmett for Cecil's father, and Emmett Morgan was a solid, dark-haired, opinionated baby who almost immediately demonstrated that he had inherited both of his parents' stubbornness, which meant he had received a double portion and would require careful management as he grew. Lenora held Emmett on the morning after he was born and looked out the bedroom window at the March light on the valley and felt something settle into place in her chest that had been loosely arranged for the whole of her life, some piece of the larger picture finding its correct position at last. She thought about the morning she had walked out of the Tucson house and left the door open, and she thought about the road north and the 4 dusty days on the back of a stubborn mule, and she thought about Harrow Creek coming into view in a valley, and a room with blue curtains, and a woman with sharp eyes, and a life building itself out of nothing but determination and $22. And she thought about a man who had stood beside her on a front step and looked at someone who called her property, and said property does not eat supper at my table. And she thought about what it meant to be claimed without being owned, to be loved without being diminished, to be someone's in the way that meant you were also more yourself than you had ever been. Cecil came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at their son and then at her, and she looked back at him and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. And he put his arm around her and they sat together in the March morning, and Emmett Morgan expressed his opinions to the room, and Cole could be heard outside in the paddock making his own kind of morning noise, and the day opened up around them bright and full and entirely their own. The years following were good years in the way that good years are good, not through the absence of difficulty, but through the presence of the right kind of people to face difficulty with. The ranch grew steadily, because Cecil was the kind of man who built things with patience and stubbornness in careful combination, and because Lenora had a head for numbers and organization that turned out to be extremely useful in the management of an enterprise of any size. She took on the account books and the correspondence and the planning of the kitchen garden with an efficiency that Cecil said twice, and then did not say again, because he did not want to make it sound like surprise, though she thought perhaps it was, a little, that something that had been kept small in Tucson could turn out to be so very large when it had room. Billy Tate married Rosa in the spring of 1880, 6 months after Emmett was born, and there was another wedding in the church and another reception in the reassigned saloon, and Cecil and Lenora stood at the back and watched with the satisfied expressions of people who have been watching something good develop over a long period and feel entitled to a little reflected warmth. Billy and Rosa took a small house in town, and Billy continued to work as Cecil's foreman and Rosa continued her work at the laundry, and the arrangement was happy and practical, and they were good neighbors and good friends, and Emmett loved them both unreservedly from the moment he was old enough to express preferences. Curo's reading improved dramatically over the course of 2 years of kitchen table work, and he wrote a letter to his family in Sonora that he was very proud of, which he showed Lenora before he sent it, and she said it was excellent and meant it, and he beamed in the quietly pleased way he had, and folded it very carefully, and addressed it in the precise handwriting of a man who had worked very hard for the precision. Widow Marsh remained a constant in their lives, coming to supper on Sundays when she wished, and receiving visits from Lenora on Wednesday afternoons, when Emmett was old enough to travel on Cole's back in front of his mother, with an expression of a person who considered himself a very important figure in any journey. The widow had, as the years passed, become something Lenora had not had for a very long time, something that resembled a mother, though she would not have used that word to the woman's face because she suspected Widow Marsh would find it sentimental, which she would, but which she would also secretly value. In the spring of 1882, Lenora was expecting again. This time the apprehension was lighter, because she had done it before and the before had gone well, and the joy was easier to reach. She told Cecil in the kitchen while she was making bread and he was fixing a hinge on the cabinet door, and he stood up from the hinge and looked at her, and the expression was the same as the first time, that depth that meant he was seeing the full extent of something. "Emmett is going to be absolutely insufferable about this," Cecil said. "He is 2 years old," Lenora said. "Exactly," Cecil said. "He is already insufferable about everything. Imagine adding a sibling to the situation." She laughed, and he came and kissed her flour-dusted hair, and she leaned back against him for a moment in the kitchen, with the bread rising under its cloth and the March light coming through the window, and thought that this was what she had been heading toward all along, even when she could not see it, even when she was walking out a door into nothing but north, and the hope that away was a real direction. Their daughter arrived in November of 1882, on a Tuesday evening when the first hard frost of autumn had coated the grass outside, and the stars were very bright and very close. She was small and dark-eyed, and arrived with a decisiveness about the whole business that suggested she had simply decided to be here and had arranged matters accordingly. They named her Me, for Cecil's mother's given name, and Emmett received this new development with the complicated feelings of a 2-year-old encountering a rival, which resolved within a week into a fierce and slightly overprotective love that would characterize their relationship for the whole of their lives. The ranch at the end of 1882 was a very different thing from the 140 acres Cecil had had when Lenora arrived in Harrow Creek. It was closer to 220 acres now, with a larger herd and a good reputation in the Regional Cattlemen's Association, and a kitchen garden that supplied not only the household, but a portion of the dry goods stores fresh produce in the growing season, which Mr. Yates had negotiated with the satisfaction of a man getting a good deal on both sides. Lenora had kept working, not at the store, though she helped there occasionally when she was needed, but at the ranch, managing the books and the ordering and the planning, and she had also taken on, quietly and without much announcement, the informal role of letter writer and advocate for several women in the valley who needed someone who could put things clearly on paper. This had begun with one woman who needed to write to a land office and had no confidence in her own writing, and had grown into something regular, and she was careful about it because the law was what it was in 1878, and what it was in 1882 was not very different. But she believed in the incremental accumulation of documentation and the incremental insistence on acknowledgement, because she had learned from her own life that small steps taken consistently in the right direction eventually produced a great deal of distance from where you had started. Cecil knew about this work and said nothing except that if she needed paper or ink from the store she should add it to the account, and this was, she thought, one of the clearest expressions of who he was, that he understood the work to be important and expressed his support for it entirely without fanfare. On an evening in the spring of 1883, she and Cecil sat on the porch after the children were asleep, which was itself a small victory because Emmett had a theory that bedtime was optional and had to be negotiated into compliance each night, and they had the valley in front of them going purple in the last of the light, and the creek running somewhere below them in the dark. "Are you happy here?" Cecil asked. He asked it the way he asked things, directly and without preface, as though the question was simply a thing he wanted to know. She considered it as a real question deserved to be considered. She looked at the valley and the last light, and she thought about the morning in Tucson and the road north, and the room with the blue curtains and the front step and the supper at Mrs. Fenwick's and the October evening on the same porch, and the December wedding and Emmett's opinionated arrival, and me's decisive one, and all the 1,000 evenings of honest conversation and mended fences and kitchen garden work and bread making, and the simple extraordinary fact of a life that was entirely and genuinely her own. "I am happy in a way I did not know I was allowed to be," she said. "And I am happy in a way that is different from anything I understood by the word before. It is not the absence of difficulty, it is something more active than that." "What is it?" he asked. She thought about it. "It is building something that matters with someone who means it," she said. "And waking up every morning inside the life you built." He took her hand in both of his, and she felt the familiar weight and warmth of that gesture, which had not diminished through repetition but had deepened, the way good things deepen. "I feel the same way," he said, nearly word for word. They sat there while the dark came fully in and the first stars appeared, and somewhere in the barn Cole made a sound that suggested he had opinions about the evening temperature. And the house behind them was quiet with the sleeping of their children. And the valley settled into the deep, good silence of a night in late spring in Arizona. And Lenora thought about property, and about freedom, and about the enormous difference between being claimed and being loved. And she thought that the distance between those two things was the distance she had traveled on a stubborn mule in 4 dusty days back in the spring of 1878, and that it was also the longest and most necessary journey she had ever made. The summer of 1883 brought a drought, which was not unusual in the territory but required careful management of the grazing rotation and the water use. And Cecil handled it with the particular form of calm competence that severe situations drew out of him, moving the cattle to the higher grass earlier than usual and negotiating water rights with the neighboring rancher. An older man named Flores, who had been in the valley since before anyone else, and who respected Cecil, because Cecil had never treated him with the condescension that some of the newer ranchers had brought west with them. Lenora managed the household water usage with a precision that impressed everyone, having read about conservation methods in an agricultural pamphlet Mr. Yates had stocked, and the kitchen garden did not fail despite the drought, which she considered a personal victory of some significance. Emmett, who was 3 and then nearly 4 through that summer, discovered that he loved horses with a passion that his father found deeply familiar and his mother found logistically complex, because a 3-year-old with strong feelings about horses and only partial physical coordination was a situation requiring constant supervision. He had, however, already formed a bond with the buckskin mare that was one of Cecil's favorites, a horse named Juniper who seemed to understand that this small person required patient management, and provided it with a dignity that Lenora found admirable. Me, at 8 months old, observed everything from whatever surface someone had placed her on with the dark-eyed thoughtfulness of a person who was cataloging information for future use. By the fall of 1883, the drought had eased and the creek was running well again, and the herd was in good condition, and Billy Tate and Rosa had their first child, a boy they named Owen, which meant Emmett had a companion of approximately the same age and opinions, and the two of them together constituted a force of nature of some significance. Widow Marsh, at the Sunday supper in October of 1883, looked at the kitchen table with its plates and cups and the 2 small children and the adults around it, and said, to no one in particular, "This is a good table." And Lenora looked at the table and looked at Cecil, who was cutting bread with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything, and looked at Emmett, who was telling Owen about horses in a tone of tremendous authority, and looked at me, who was looking at all of it with those dark, thoughtful eyes, and she thought, yes, it is. It was a good table. It had been built by a person who understood the difference between claiming and owning. A person who had looked at a woman on a front step in the sunlight and said property does not eat supper at my table, meaning that she was not property and what she was a person, a whole and complete and capable person with a chair at this table, and a name and a voice, and a stake in everything that was built here. She had come north with nothing but $22 and a stubborn mule, and the absolute unshakable knowledge that she was more than the space someone else had decided to keep her in. And she had found, in a valley in Arizona in the spring of 1878, the ground on which to prove it. There had been letters and fear and a cold-voiced man on a gray horse, and a street full of people standing quietly with her. And there had been a man who stood beside her and not in front of her, which was the whole of the difference and the whole of everything. She had built a life here. She had built it with her own hands and her own stubbornness and her own willingness to learn the things she did not know. And she had built it alongside a man who understood that two people building something together were building something larger than either of them could build alone, and who had never once, in all the years since the October porch and the December church, and the March morning when Emmett arrived, and the November evening when me arrived, never once made her feel that the life she was building was anything other than her own. The years would continue to move forward in the way that years do, carrying changes and challenges, and the slow accumulation of seasons that becomes a life. There would be more good years and some harder ones, and the children would grow into people of their own with their own opinions and their own stubbornness, which was unavoidable given the source material. There would be more suppers at the table with the people they loved, and more evenings on the porch watching the valley settle into the dark. There would be more letters written on behalf of women in the valley who needed someone to help them be heard, more conversations with Abel Cord about what the law allowed and what it did not, and what small pressures might be applied in the right direction over time. There would be more kitchen garden seasons and more fence mending and more conversations with Cole, who aged slowly and with immense dignity and who never did stop having opinions. But on this October evening in 1883, with the table set and the food on it and the people around it, Lenora Conley Morgan looked at what she had built from the improbable raw material of 4 dusty days on a mule and $22, and a determination that had not broken when everything around it was designed to break it. And she felt the simple, enormous weight of a good life, a life that was entirely and permanently her own. And across the table Cecil met her eyes and the corner of his mouth moved in that particular way, and she smiled back at him fully, with nothing held in reserve, and that was the whole of it, and it was more than enough.